Hey there, today we're discussing the actions of November 28th and the night of November 28th at the Chosin Reservoir. So by now, the Marines have been severely bloodied at all perimeters, Coterie, Hagaru, Udamni, as well as RCT 31 on the east of the Chosin Reservoir. The Marines know now decidedly that they are trapped. The MSR has been cut. Their single supply route to the sea has been severed by the Chinese, about 9 Chinese divisions, and they now know that they must fight their way out. So, the situation we find ourselves in the morning of the 28th, so working from north to south, so the 5th and 7th Marine Regiments at Udamni, so Charlie 1-5 and Able 1-5 are able to consolidate on Hill 1282. The night before, Echo 2-7 or Easy 2-7 had essentially been shattered in the defense of that hill, but they were able to hold. Uh, Overnight, Charlie and Able Company were sent up to reinforce, and they hold that position when morning comes on the 28th. Dog Company of the 7th Marines is holding Hill 1240 barely. A platoon of Charlie 1-5 is sent to reinforce, and those two units together clear Hill 1240 during the early morning hours of November 28th. Howe 2-7 is pushed off Hill 1403, which leads to 3-5 CP coming under fire and the H&S Company pulling out. George Company 3-5 is able to clear the valley floor of Chinese who are running around. However, the high ground of Hill 1403 is still occupied by the Chinese 89th Division, which is able to bring basically the entirety of Udamni under fire from the high ground. And they do harass Udamni throughout the day. So Charlie 1-7 is trapped on the 28th at about 10:15 on the 28th. 1-7 Alpha and Baker Company, or Able and Baker Company, fight the 4 miles down to Charlie Company and relieve them, and they make it back to Udamni at 21:15. So if you think about these Marines, sub-zero temperatures, fighting off attacks all night, and then the next morning having to make a 4 mile basically movement to contact the entire way in sub-zero temperatures, in snow, to relieve their Charlie Company minus, which is only 2 platoons, and the 2 platoons of Charlie Company come back with over 45 wounded. The intent was for Fox 2-7 to break out from their perimeter at Tuk Tong Pass and move north and meet up with the Charlie Company 1-7 combined relief force. They determined they have too many casualties from the night before, and they basically stay in their position at Tuk Tong Pass. So on the afternoon of the 28th, Lieutenant Colonel Murray and Colonel Litzenberg discuss, and they realize that there's no longer any advancement to the west, and they need to consolidate their forces at Udamni. So 2-5 retrogrades from Northwest Ridge to Southwest Ridge, and they tie in on 3-7's flank. Item Company 3-5 relieves 1-5 on Hill 1282. And Howe and Golf Company. So Item Company on Hill 1282 is basically the central link in the defense of the north and western passages to Udamni. So Item Company occupies the high ground, which is Hill 1282, and then Howe and George companies of 3-5 tie in on the flanks in the low ground to prevent the Chinese from flowing around the high ground into the regiment's rear. And so 3-5 is oriented essentially northwest of Udamni. So things on the east side of the reservoir are not as good as they are at Udamni. So a reminder, that's what we would call Task Force Faith, but it's Regimental Combat Team 31, which is combined an ad hoc force of 1st Battalion of the 32nd, 3rd Battalion of the 30, or 3rd Battalion of the 31st, as well as 2 field artillery battalions, an anti-air battalion, and the regimental CP. They also have the 31st Tank Company. A lot of these units are separate and not co-located. So there's a 31st Tank Company down south of the inlet. So The furthest north unit is Lieutenant Colonel Faith with 132. South of him by about 4 miles is the inlet position, which is the 3rd Battalion of the 31st, as well as 2 field artillery battalions or batteries and the anti-air battery. And then about 2 miles south of that is separate the 31st Tank Company with about 22 tanks. Also located with that tank company is General Hodes, who is the 7th Infantry Division Assistant Division Commander. So he is kind of the on-scene commander for the eastern side of the reservoir, and he's co-located with this tank company. So he decides with this tank platoon commander or this tank platoon company commander, tank company commander, that they need to attack north and relieve some of the pressure at the inlet position. So, as we discussed yesterday, there's a hairpin turn just north of their position at Hill 1221. The medical company had gone through the night before, the night of the 27th, and had been badly destroyed. A lot of their vehicles were on the road, off the road in ditches, as well as a Chinese roadblock was built on the road, as well as Chinese infantry occupying the high position. So a tank attack unsupported by infantry fails. Additionally, Captain Drakes, who's this tank company commander, has no comms with the 32nd or the 31st Infantry or the Field Artillery battalions, which are only 2 miles up the road. So he receives no field artillery or infantry support. So General Hodes decides to take a tank south to the Marine position at Hagaru to get some support, and he will never return further north back to the regimental combat team position. So with some airstrikes, the 31st Infantry is able to reoccupy their positions, which got overrun the night before. If you remember, we discussed the 3rd Battalion of the 31st gets overrun. Most of their rifle companies withdraw back to Bravo Battery's position. But with the help of airstrikes, a lot of straggler groups, as well as a reorganized counterattack, are able to occupy the positions that they left the night before. And then additionally, kind of the key thing, there's a anti-tank or anti-air company, which has half-track mounted quad 50 cals. They have about 7 vehicles, and they are integrated into the 31st Infantry position, and they're probably the best anti-infantry weapon that the Army has on that side. So I'm going to go to Escaping the Trap, U.S. Army X Corps in Northeast Korea by Lieutenant Colonel Roy Appleman, and discuss the position there. And this is Drake's counter, or this is an interesting event that happens on the 28th, which is General Almond flies up to visit the 1st of the 32nd and Lieutenant Colonel Faith. This is kind of an infamous incident, so I want to reference this specifically. On 28 November, Major General Edward M. Almond visited the 7th Division's forward element, the 1st Battalion, 32nd Infantry. He flew from Hamhung to Hagaru-ri in an L-17 plane with his 26-year-old junior aide, Lieutenant Craig. There he conferred with Major General Oliver Smith, commander of the 1st Marine Division, who had established his CP there at Hagaru. Then Almond arranged for a helicopter to fly him to the 7th Infantry's forward position for a meeting with Colonel McLean and Lieutenant Colonel Faith. So Lieutenant Colonel Faith was at the forward position, and Colonel McLean was at his advanced CP, which was co-located with the 1st of the 32nd Infantry. In his conversations with these two officers, Almond learned that neither of them knew anything more about the situation than he. Almond thought the previous night's battle was fought against elements of the Chinese 124th, 125th, and 126th Divisions, which had been known to have been in the Chosin area for more than a month. Almond thought Faith seemed on edge during the conversations and resentful of the situation. Almond told Faith he should try to regain before nightfall the high ground he had lost during the day. McLean told Almond McLean again is the 31st Regimental CO. McLean told Almond he was establishing his regimental CP just south of Faith's position and that he thought his RCT could hold on, and he seemed to agree with Amon that when his 2nd Battalion, 31st Infantry arrived, he could advance northward. It appears that neither Amon nor McLean knew at the meeting of the serious delays the 2nd Battalion had encountered in its move to join McLean. Neither does it appear that either of them knew much about the situation at the inlet, which is where his battalion was further south. Before he left to return to Hagaruri, Amon told Faith that he wanted to award 3 silver stars, one to him and the other two to members of the 1st Battalion that he should select. Faith protested that there were others more deserving than he, but Amon insisted he should receive one of them. Faith selected Lieutenant Everett F. Smalley, a C Company platoon leader who had been wounded during the night's battle and who was sitting nearby, and asked him to come receive one of the medals. Headquarters Company Mess Sergeant George A. Stanley, who had performed well during the night, chanced to be passing the group. Faith called him over to receive the 3rd decoration. Ahmed had awarded 3 silver stars to the Marines at Udamni the day before, and this ceremony was to be an even-handed award to the 7th Division Army men. After Ahmed had left the meeting to return to his helicopter, Faith angrily ripped the decoration from his parka and threw it onto the ground in the snow. Curtis, Bigger, Jones, and May have all confirmed privately the fact that they witnessed the ceremony. May was standing closest to Ahmed, and May was standing closest to Ahmed and Faith, and heard Ahmed say to Faith that he should not worry about the Chinese force, that it was only stragglers fleeing north. There was considerable talk in the battalion about this incident afterward. General Ahmed was the only officer of the 7th Infantry Division, the 1st Marine Division, or the X Corps other than Lieutenant Haig to visit the Forward Infantry Battalion on the east side of Chosin after the Chinese launched their attack. So, a small shot of the Marines there, and that the Marine Division didn't visit or basically support Regimental Combat Team 31. But at this point, with the presence of Regimental Command and the fact that they fell under the 7th Infantry Division, 1st Marine Division truly had no obligation to the Army units, as well as with only 2 rifle companies at Hagaru, which we'll go into, that they can barely keep Hagaru secure. It was unlikely that there was ever going to be any type of relief or support from the Marine position at Hagaru. So, going into Hagaru. So, there are only 2 rifle companies at Hagaru from 3-1. So, there's Howe Company and Item Company. George Company, we'll talk about tomorrow, is famously at Qinghongni due to lack of trucks, and they will have to fight a gauntlet up the MSR northward as part of Task Force Drysdale just to make it to Hagaru. And that's an ordeal all their own, and they will fight northward further deeper into Chinese territory to reinforce Hagaru, but we'll discuss that tomorrow. So Howe and Item Companies of 3-1 basically decide, so the 3-1 battalion commander decides that the most likely enemy avenue of approach is to the south and southwest. So he decides, instead of being weak everywhere, he'll be strong somewhere. And that's at the south and southwest, where he puts his 2 infantry rifle companies. So he expects George 3-1 to arrive sometime on the 28th, and he was going to station them at East Hill, which he decided was the next biggest threat, dominating terrain over Hagaru. But they were held at Kodo-ri, and the road to Hagaru was not open. And again, we'll discuss them tomorrow. So what's done is East Hill is held by, or tasked to be defended by Dog Company of the 10th Engineer Battalion, which is an Army unit, as well as headquarters personnel from the X Corps CP. So X Corps General Ahmed sent an advanced CP unit, like a forward, to Hagaru, and the Marines say, great, you're provisional riflemen now, get up on East Hill, it's a key piece of terrain we need to hold. So what the Marines do is they lend 2 officers. 2-7's weapons company is still in Hagaru as well. So a captain and a lieutenant are taken from the weapons company and assigned basically to supervise and liaison with these Army troops, and basically take command and a little bit of structure that the Marine command of Hagaru can interface with. As well, there's Marines from the 1st Service Battalion intermixed here on East Hill as well. There's a regimental anti-tank company. They hold the position just north of East Hill. Their left flank is basically Howe Battery 311, So they're pulling frontline duty as well as being tasked with fires in support of Fox 27. In between Hotel 311 and the infantry company are just various units. Some of those include the 1st Service Battalion, 1st Motor Transport Battalion, Marine Tactical Air Control Squadron, Division Headquarters Battalion, and H&S Company of 3-1. So definitely a every Marine a rifleman moment, not in jest, not ironically. Seriously, every Marine that can hold a rifle is going out to the line and expected to perform, because if any part of the line gets overrun, it doesn't matter if you're infantry or not, your liability. And basically, if Hagaru falls, the 5th and 7th Marines are trapped, Regimental Combat Team 31's trapped, as well as the Marines at Kodo really don't have the manpower to get south. So further south at Kodo, Kodo-ri, that's held by 2-1, as well as Echo Battery, 2nd Battalion, 11th Marines. On the 28th, Dog Company from 2-1 is assigned to open the road to Hagaru. They make it less than a mile from the Kodo perimeter, and they're turned back. On the 28th, George Company, 41st Commando, as well as Baker Company, 1st of the 32nd, so the Army troops, the rest of Colonel McLean's regiment, they arrive on the 28th, too late to attack further north to Hagaru, so they're pushed in the line. So Kodo-ri on the night of the 28th is actually extremely well defended, but they don't really receive any attacks. The biggest action that occurs on the 28th at night is going to be on the east perimeter against what we call Task Force Faith, or against the Army troops on the east perimeter. So at this point from the night before, the Chinese occupy Hill 1456, and they're able to harass the inlet position all throughout the day. So all day while they're counterattacking, retaking positions, gathering ammunition, they're coming under harassing fire at the inlet. As night falls, K Company, 3rd Battalion, 31st Infantry is attacked by the Chinese. They achieve a penetration. They're not able to fully exploit that, and that penetration is reduced in the morning. However, there are heavy attacks on the south and west, and attacks all throughout the perimeter. However, the enemy withdraws before daybreak because they fear airstrikes. Further north, with Lieutenant Colonel Faith at the 1st Battalion of the 32nd Infantry, they face a extremely fierce attack after midnight across the line. So Alpha Company is on the left flank, has a platoon cut off. Charlie Company on the right flank, one of their squads loses their positions and they're pushed back that they can't retake. And that's again at the boundary with Baker Company, as happened last night. So the attacks are so fierce and continuous at 02. Colonel McLean, who's co-located with Lieutenant Colonel Faith, orders the 1st of the 32nd to withdraw and fight south to link up with 322 or 332 at the inlet. So you can imagine how hard it is to get convoys and Marines accounted for, just go to the field. These soldiers are being asked to get all their wounded on vehicles, get accountability. It's 02. They're under enemy attack. It's dark. They don't have flashlights. They don't have night vision. And within 2 hours, get an entire battalion on the road, on vehicles, moving south through enemy territory while the rifle companies move adjacent and fight a rearguard action. Amazingly, by 0430, they're able to do this, and the convoy moves south. They have approximately 60 vehicles loaded with wounded, and they're able to move 4 miles south to the inlet through enemy territory, fighting off the enemy the whole way. A sad part of this, and probably a piece of the history that deserves to be looked at more, is that Alpha Company or Able Company is forced to leave its isolated platoon. They can't relieve their platoon that got cut off. They can't counterattack to make it to them, so they're forced to fight a rear guard and to leave that platoon that's trapped. So I'm going to go ahead and read, and this is interesting, these are quotes from the 1st of the 32nd. So this is from the battalion that moves south. And basically, they're describing the inlet position as worse than what they just experienced. So the scene of the 3rd Battalion perimeter across the inlet was one of chaos in the early pre-dawn light. Major Curtis, who at this time broke over the crest of Hill 1324 and had the inlet and 3rd Battalion perimeter area spread out below him in one great panorama, wrote in his manuscript, quote, "The quote perimeter of the 3 of the 31st and the 57th Field Artillery, when I saw it from the ridgeline, was a scene of destruction. It had effectively been reduced and was offering no organized resistance. There was smoke, fog, and very limited visibility. There was a sizable column of troops moving down the road to the southeast along what had been part of the perimeter. I recognized them as Chinese troops and assumed correctly, I think, that they were bypassing the perimeter and moving south since the perimeter had been reduced. Lieutenant Campbell of D Company had been with those who climbed the hill from the vicinity of the mortar position. He viewed the same spectacle that Curtis described from near the same spot and agreed with his assessment. He wrote that the 3rd Battalion area appeared a scene of total devastation. Captain Bigger, with Colonel McLean, saw the same spectacle as it appeared from the road level along the inlet. Bigger wrote, quote, "As our battalion command group arrived on the north side of the inlet, we could look across the ice and see that the 3rd Battalion, 31st, and the 57th Field Artillery were heavily engaged. Chinese were pouring down the surrounding hill toward the perimeter of the units. The quad 50 machine guns and the dual 40mm anti-tank weapons of the 57th were taking a heavy toll on the Chinese columns. It was like being a spectator at a large screen movie for a moment. It was about this time that we observed a column of troops approaching the perimeter of the 31st from the south along the road. Bigger said that the column coming from the south had not yet reached the western edge of the 3rd Battalion perimeter, but was approaching it. He said that Colonel McLean was overjoyed at the sight of the column approaching from the south across the inlet. He thought it was the 2nd Battalion, 31st Infantry, that he had been anxiously awaiting and expecting to arrive and join him at the Chosin reservoir. There was firing from this group toward the perimeter and return fire from the perimeter. McLean thought there was imminent battle between the two battalions of his regiment and that there was a lack of mutual identification. Bigger wrote that McLean looked at the scene for a moment and then said, "Those are my boys." His immediate impulse was to get across the inlet and stop the firing between the two battalions. McLean turned to Bigger and said, "Here, take this order and give it to Faith." He rapidly delivered an oral order to Bigger that generally followed the usual 5-point field order. He then turned and strode out onto the ice of the inlet, headed for the other side. Bigger watched. After McLean got some distance out on the ice, Bigger could see that the men on the other side were firing at him, and he saw him fall several times. But each time McLean got up and continued on. As McLean neared the other bank, Bigger could see Chinese soldiers come out to the edge of the ice, where they took hold of McLean and pulled him to brush-covered ground. They led him up the bank and onto the road and then out of view. Bigger said the incident took place about a half-mile west of the bridge, about midway between the turn of the road eastward along the inlet and the bridge. Others saw McLean cross the inlet, including Lieutenant Colonel Faith, Major Jones, and Major Curtis. Their reports essentially matched Bigger's. Later in the morning, after he had crossed the inlet, Faith ordered C Company, which was to establish its position in a new perimeter along the south bank of the inlet, to make a search in that area for McLean. The company made the search, necessarily limiting it to the area of the perimeter, but found no trace of McLean. Inquiry disclosed that no one of the 3rd Battalion or 57th Field Artillery had seen McLean or witnessed his capture. McLean had reached the south bank of the inlet west of the 3rd Battalion perimeter, and the folded nature of the ground and brush had obscured their view of him. The Chinese soldiers who had captured McLean quickly left that part of the inlet as daybreak was at hand. McLean's ultimate fate was unknown until an American prisoner released by the Chinese said that in early December 1950, he and McLean and many other prisoners were moved north from the Chosin Reservoir to a prisoner camp. He said that the Americans cared for and helped the wounded colonel all they could, but he had died of his wounds on the 4th day of the journey. His comrades buried him in a grave alongside the road. McLean was the highest ranking officer in the U.S. Armed Forces in Northeast Korea to lose his life to enemy action. That's in Northeast Korea because General Walker will be killed later, but that is not this time. Okay, so that's the story of the Army on the east side of Chosin Reservoir, and it's not a good one. At Udom Knee, after pretty savage fights the night before, and we discussed counterattacks to regain Marine positions. The night of the 28th is pretty quiet. Some scattered mortar fire, but no infantry contacts. So I'm going to go to Lecky to discuss Hagaru and the situation there. Item Company was holding. Bullfisher and his men were holding as perhaps no line had ever held before. The Chinese blundered into that wicked labyrinth of trip flares, booby traps, landmines, and cans of gasoline, all covered by machine guns, rifles, and mortars, and they met annihilation there. Only 3 Chinese came within closing distance of a Marine. They rushed at Second Lieutenant Wayne Hall, certain of their man, when they saw he could not fire his carbine, but Hall drew his pistol and killed all 3, the last pitching forward into his hole. Otherwise, the carnage was incredible. Roaming the lines, his great figure, a splendid target, Fisher called down 1,700 mortar shells upon the crumbling, trapped Chinese. At midnight, the tracers of his machine guns fingered the Korean huts with fire and set them ablazing, and the carnage was complete. That was how Item Company held, with 2 men killed and 16 wounded. And when dawn crept suddenly over that frozen southern battlefield, souvenir hunters who picked their wary way among the red-stained, snow-covered mounds that were once living men counted up to 750 of them before the arrival of Marine air sent them scurrying back to their pits. East Hill had been overrun. Ridge's worst fears had been realized. Throughout the afternoon of the 28th, he had hoped that George Company would be able to force its way up the road from Coto Reet, but they had been halted at a roadblock, turned back. Now Ridge was forced to cover East Hill, that is the right-hand curve of his perimeter, with Captain Shellnut's untrained force of about 200 Army engineers from 10th Corps. And of these, perhaps half were green South Korean troops who spoke no English. These were the rocks of the buddy system, forced upon understrength Army units. They were assigned to American buddies in the vain hope that they would learn quickly and perhaps pick up a little English. This was the ragged force that made the exhausting climb of East Hill in the late hours of the day. Slipping and sliding over ice and frozen rocks, carrying stores of ammunition, they pulled themselves up the steep face of the 600-foot high hill. When they got there, some were lucky enough to occupy positions already dug. Most of them had no cover. Many had frozen weapons. Some of the rocks didn't know how to use them. But by dark, Captain Shellnut reported through his radio operator, PFC Bruno Podolak, that they were in position. Lieutenant Colonel Ridge's relief quickly gave way to a prayer that the Chinese would not strike East Hill. But by 2 in the morning of the 29th, he knew that his prayer had been answered, and the answer was no. Under heavy attack, Shellnut radioed. 30 minutes later, Shellnut was dead, and PFC Podolak was the only living American on East Hill. The communists had hit with shattering force. They had obliterated a rock platoon on the left, many of whom perished without firing a shot, and rolled up on the flank of Shellnut's engineers in a fury that threw them all the way down the hill. I'm alone up here, Podolak reported, his voice sunk to a whisper. I can't get down with this heavy gear. I'll hide somewhere and keep you informed. Podolak kept his promise. He kept Ridge supplied with a steady flow of situation reports, all of which were bleak. In some, Podolak reported that the Chinese held East Hill in a battalion strength and they were digging. Ridge called for artillery. He ordered a counterattack, while Howe Battery of the 11th Marines shifted trails, reversed guns, and drew a curtain of steel across the gap, pounding the Chinese massing areas in the ravines and lowlands beyond. Ridge's XO, Major Myers, hastened to collect all available Marines and rally East Hill's routed defenders for a counterthrust. For East Hill could not be lost. It aimed a dagger at the throat of Hagaru. It threatened the Marine lines to either side. All this was clear to Myers as he led his reserve of Marines to the roadside ditch where he found most of the engineers. They were huddled together, cold, stunned, and demoralized. Myers moved among them, urging, commanding, organizing. The dull light of dawn was beginning behind the hill before he had last reformed a skirmish line and started upwards. Howe Battery lifted fire. Its 105s had sent 1,200 rounds howling into the black, and now it was time to knock it off and let the tanks and mortars take over. They blasted the hilltop. Myers began his attack. Shifting from Lecky to maybe the little more historical book, the Marine history. Half an hour later, with the situation improving in the Howe Company zone, the battalion CP had its first alarming reports of reverses on East Hill. The terrain itself had offered difficulties to men scrambling up the steep, icy slopes with heavy burdens of ammunition. These detachments of service troops, moreover, included a large portion of newly recruited Rocks who had little training and understood no English. At 0400, there was little to prevent the enemy from making a complete breakthrough on East Hill and attacking the Division CP and the supply dumps. A friendly foothold had been retained on reverse slopes of the southern nose, but the northern part was held only by artillery fires. Along the road at the bottom of East Hill, a thin line of service troops with several tanks and machine guns formed a weak barrier. All indications point to the fact that the Chinese themselves were not in sufficient strength to follow up on their successes. Their attack on East Hill was apparently a secondary and diversionary effort in support of the main assault on the sectors held by Howe and Item companies. At any rate, the enemy contented himself with holding the high ground he had won. Some of the defenders of East Hill had fought with bravery, which is more admirable because of their lack of combat training. Battle is a business for specialists, and Lieutenant Rosen relates that the Army engineers had a great difficulty with our weapons because they were cold and fired sluggishly. So I'm just going to fast forward here. Captain Schromenger's dog battery had been attached to 3-1 so long that a high degree of coordination existed. His 105s fired about 1,200 rounds that night, and POW interrogations disclosed that the enemy concentration in rear areas were repeatedly broken up. When CCF guns replied shortly after midnight, there was danger of fuel or ammunition dump being hit and starting a chain reaction of detonations in the crowded perimeter. Schromenger ordered 5 of his howitzers to cease fire while he moved the 6th out about 150 yards to act as decoy. Its flashes drew fire from the enemy as he had hoped, revealing the positions of the Chinese artillery. Dog battery officers set up 2 aiming circles and calculated the range and deflection. Then the command was given for all 6 Marine howitzers to open up. The enemy guns were silenced for the night. A later survey established that 2 CCF 76mm guns had been destroyed and 2 others removed. And that about sums up the night of the 28th. Of course, Fox Company at Tok Tong Pass has another desperate night where they basically fight for their own survival, and we'll cover their relief within the next few days. So I hope you're enjoying the series, learning about the Chosin Reservoir battle in a little more depth than the standard Marines were surrounded and they fought out. It was truly a desperate battle where the 1st Marine Division was in threat of being destroyed. At this point in the battle, it's certainly surrounded. It looks bleak. The MSR is cut. There's dozens of miles to march out through 9 to 12 Chinese divisions. The eastern flank is crumbling with RCT 31 being reduced by the hour. The U.S. 8th Army on the west is being pushed back, and there will be an entire cavalry regiment that gets surrounded and almost destroyed. So, and on top of all that, it's really cold. So I hope you're enjoying this, and I hope you'll join me tomorrow for the next day where we discuss the actions of the night of the 28th into the 29th.